Hi, thank you for having me.
Fiorella, what does another Daniel Ortega presidential term mean for Nicaragua?
Nicaraguans are largely supportive of the president, Daniel Ortega, unlike what you hear in mainstream media, especially Western and U.S. and NATO-backed media. We just heard this morning that the United States Department of Treasury has issued new sanctions for Nicaragua, specifically for diplomats and high-ranking military officials, which was something that we could see was coming. However, it kind of shows just how impactful geopolitically this whole situation will be. We have the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, arriving, president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, also arriving. And so what we're seeing here is a new era of affiliations with Iran, China, and Russia in a time where the United States is experiencing drastic and dire economic policies. Nicaragua is building, it's rebuilding, it's expanding. There is talk of a potential canal being built that would absolutely change the trade and the economic possibilities of the entire Central American region.
Fiorella, Ortega was re-elected with over 76% of the vote in November, and the Sandinista National Liberation Front also secured another landslide victory, increasing its parliamentary majority. How can we explain this rising support, even in the midst of the attacks by some domestic sectors and by Western powers against the Nicaraguan government, as you've mentioned?
Right. So being with a delegation, I have traveled to certain parts of Nicaragua where there was so much poverty prior to Daniel Ortega's government and the FSM, and that has changed drastically in the last few years. For example, Bilwi is a autonomous zone in the Caribbean north of the country, and that is full of indigenous people that speak different languages, and they experience back-to-back hurricanes of Category 4 and 5, and they really talked about relying on the Ortega government for rebuilding. They got their houses rebuilt, and a lot of the schools are being rebuilt as we speak. Meanwhile, you compare Puerto Rico in the United States, where disaster capitalism takes place, and investors from, wealthy investors go in there and they exploit the country's resources, and we see a completely different situation. Also in Nicaragua, what we're seeing is a push for taking care of its people. We visited a Bismarck Martinez Center. It was a center where people were allowed to have housing, and it was a very, very low-cost housing. 2/3 was covered by the government, only 1/3 was covered by the people, and people were speaking about that excitedly. Nicaragua has by far the best roads in the Americas. There are roads in the United States right now that are far worse than anything I've seen here in Nicaragua. And so I really have a hard time seeing the quote-unquote reports from the so-called journalists of the mainstream media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all Reuters today, just talking about Daniel Ortega being an oppressor and talking about journalism, when once again, we're seeing the persecution of journalists by the State Department, including journalists like Julian Assange, who is still sitting in Belmarsh prison as we speak.
Fiorella, you mentioned there are sanctions, but what are the challenges going forwards for the Nicaraguan government?
Right, so sanctions are an act of siege warfare. Unfortunately, sanctions have affected many of the Latin American countries. We've seen them affect Cuba. We've seen them affect. The one thing I will say about Nicaragua is they have been preparing for this moment. Nicaragua is largely self-sufficient. A lot of the materials that they use for construction and for other parts of sectors, including agriculture, they use from their own. So while sanctions will absolutely affect the country, Nicaraguans are prepared to be self-sufficient. And we have seen that through the cooperatives and the agricultural regions and organizations like the ATC, which have helped kind of bring back an interest and an investment of the people into the rural economy, into agriculture, not just urbanization. So I think in the difference between Nicaragua and Venezuela and other countries is that Nicaragua has learned from others and is preparing itself, is expecting these sanctions. So they're going to know how to proceed, as well as making alliances with now China by recognizing China over Taiwan. And so what we're seeing is they're ready to make these business deals that are going to help bring them up while dealing with these disastrous sanctions.
Political analyst and an activist, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your insight into this important day for Nicaragua and, as you say, for the rest of the region. Thank you.